The land was dying quiet when Elias Cole first heard the scream. A sound like something torn from the belly of the earth, thin and raw, carried on wind that rustled brittle cottonwood leaves along the river bend. He paused mid-step in his pasture, hand resting on the old fence post, and turned his weathered face toward the low horizon where the water cut through the scrub like a dark ribbon. Dusk was settling in. The sky burned faint orange behind thin gray clouds. He heard it again. Not the cry of coyote or calf. This was a woman. Without a word, he unlatched his chestnut mare from the rail, swung into the saddle, and nudged her toward the sound. The hooves moved soft across the dry grass. He rode slow. Always did.
The world had already taken everything?
That could be rushed along the riverbank. He found her. She was slumped beneath a crooked cottonwood, half in the reeds, bare feet caked in mud and dried blood. A thin blanket clung to her like wet parchment, and inside her arms a baby wailed, red-faced and trembling. She rocked slightly as if trying to keep from breaking apart altogether. Her hair was black and tangled, stuck to her cheeks. Her eyes, when they opened, were hollow and wild. Elias didn't speak. He dismounted, approached with the same care he gave to frightened colts. The woman flinched when he reached down, but didn't resist when he gently unwrapped the bundle in her arms and pressed 2 fingers to the baby's neck. The child was alive barely. "I got you," he murmured. The first words he'd spoken in a day. She blinked slowly. He lifted both mother and child into the saddle, held them against his chest, and walked the horse back through the silver grass, never looking back. The ranch house was a lean thing of old timber, squatting between 2 low hills with a sagging roof and a porch that creaked under the weight of memories. The woman said nothing as he carried her inside. The baby had gone quiet, a frightening quiet, like breath trying to remember itself. He placed her gently near the hearth and stoked the fire. Then he poured warm water into a basin, found a clean cloth, and held it out. She took it with shaking hands. "Food?" he asked. She nodded. He spooned beans into a tin bowl and set it beside her with a crust of bread. She ate like someone unsure if it was real. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, there was only the slow crackle of flame and the faint gurgle of the baby finally suckling at her breast. Elias sat in his rocker, hands resting on his knees, watching the fire. "I didn't speak, didn't ask." It was a long while before she finally said, "Mariah." Her voice was hoarse and low, like a wind that's lost its direction. He gave a slow nod, still not looking at her. "Elias." She didn't say more. Neither did he. A dusty cradle sat forgotten in the corner of the cabin. He'd carved it long ago for a child that never came. The rocking chair beneath him had belonged to his wife, gone 14 winters now. The mantel, an old coffee mug, sat turned upside down. Still waiting for hands that never returned, the woman sat near the fire through the night. Her feet were tucked beneath her, wrapped again in the torn blanket. The child finally slept, mouth still wet from milk, tiny hand clutching a strand of her mother's hair. Elias dozed in the chair, one eye open. Boots still on. Somewhere past midnight he stirred. Mariah was still awake watching him. "I won't stay long," she said. "You'll stay warm," he replied. And that was the only thing either of them said until the sun came back. By morning, the wind had died. Smoke curled softly from the chimney. Tracks by the river were already half erased by the dust. The town wouldn't hear about the woman until days later. And when they did, the whispers ran quick. A reclusive rancher sheltering a native woman and her child. No preacher in sight. No papers drawn. But Elias didn't listen to town. He only knew this. When the land forgot to be kind, a man still could choose otherwise. And sometimes, that choice was enough to change everything. The nights were colder out there than Mariah had expected. Not cold like mountain air, but the kind of cold that soaked through the boards of the cabin and crept into your bones while you pretended not to shiver. She never took the bed. Elias had offered it quiet, with a single nod, toward the corner room, but she shook her head and spread the same blanket from the river on the floor beside the hearth. The baby woke often. Noma, she had named her. A small thing, barely the weight of a sack of flour, but loud when hungry and louder when not. Each night, Elias sat in his rocker, always facing the fire. Hands like tree bark curled around his knees. He didn't tell her what he thought when the crying began, didn't shift or sigh, just rocked slowly, like he was waiting for something to settle in him. She noticed how his jaw clenched when her baby cried. It's not in anger, but something else. Pain, maybe? Distance? He noticed how she never turned her back when he walked by. She always kept one eye on him, like a rabbit listening for the wrong rustle in the grass. One night, as the coyotes howled beyond the hills and the fire hissed, in the stones, Elias stirred the coals with the end of a long iron. Mariah sat nursing the baby in silence, hair loose over her shoulder. Her eyes drifted to the chair. "Did it belong to someone?" she asked softly. He didn't turn, just nodded once. She looked down at the flames and said no more. That was the first thread. The next day, she hung her braid outside to dry after washing it in river water. It was long and thick, knotted near the end with a bit of red thread. Elias passed by on his way to the barn and paused. He didn't say anything, but he looked long enough for her to notice. The braid was more than just hair. It held years. Held a girl from another valley. A mother who taught her songs in the old tongue. A sister who once braided it with hands that were later buried in a settler's ditch. Mariah didn't cut it when she left. She couldn't. It was the only piece of her life she could carry that wouldn't bleed or cry out. Elias. Two carried things without names. That evening, as he wiped dust from an old picture frame on the mantel, Mariah saw the face of a young woman, fair-haired, soft-cheeked, holding a flower against her lips. "My wife," he said, as if the words were a chore. "Anna." What happened? Kept polishing the glass, but his hand slowed. "Midwife bled her wrong," he said. "Tried to fix it too late. Said no more." Mara nodded. My mother died that way." The silence after wasn't empty. It was full of something shared. Later, when the fire had burned low and the cabin fell into its nightly hush, Elias brought out a small tin from a drawer. Inside were a few items: a locket with no chain, a broken ring, and a square of linen stained by time. He set the tin near the fire, then turned away. Mariah didn't ask what the linen was. She already knew. That night, for the first time, she laid the baby in the old cradle. It creaked when it rocked. The same sound that probably once drove him mad, back when he expected it to keep rocking long after it had stopped. She stood over it a long while, then turned to the fire and said, "Thank you." Elias just nodded again. The days passed without pattern. He tended the cattle, mended fences, chopped wood. She cleaned the floors, bathed Noma in the basin, fed the chickens. They moved around one another like ghosts who hadn't quite decided if they wanted to live. Sometimes their hands brushed when passing tools. Sometimes they sat near the fire, neither speaking, but not needing to. The rifle stayed on the wall above the door, untouched, but always visible. The baby's blanket, stitched from bits of Mariah's old clothes. Bits of cloth she'd hidden in a tin to take when she ran, lay draped over the cradle's side, like a flag of two worlds stitched into one. She didn't speak of the man who claimed her. The traitor with cracked teeth and cold eyes. The one who took her from her people under a trade of salt and lies. Called her wife, but used her like cattle. Who threatened to sell the baby before it ever cried. She left when her water broke. Crawled for miles on hands that still bore the cuts. Her back still bore the bruises. Elias never asked about them, but she knew he'd seen. One morning, when frost covered the barn latch, she found a small bundle on her side of the porch. A scarf, warm wool, with a note pinned, "River girls need warmth." She smiled without showing teeth. And that night, she set a second tin cup on the table when she poured coffee. They didn't toast or touch. But when she sat, he filled the cup, and for the first time, he drank from his own. The wind arrived before the rain, whispering through the cottonwoods like old voices returning home. Elias watched the sky from the porch, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. It was the kind of storm that came once every few seasons, the kind that pulled nails from roofs and stirred things men tried to bury. He buttoned his coat slowly. nodded toward the cabin where Mariah stood in the door holding Noma, made his way toward the barn behind him. The wind grew teeth. By the time he secured the horses and bolted the doors, the rain had started fierce and slanting, cutting across the mesa like whipcord. Lightning split the sky above the ridge, painting the world in white and black dot. Mara crouched near the fire, shawl around her shoulders, rocking the baby with a pace that matched the wind's rhythm. Her eyes flicked to the windows with each THUNDERCLAP. The door opened hard against the wind as Elias stepped in, water dripping from his coat, boots soaked to the ankle. He hung his hat on the peg and threw 2 more logs on the fire. It was only then they heard the second set of hooves. Distant at first, muffled by the rain, then louder, closer, deliberate. Mariah's face drained of color. She rose to her feet without realizing, clutching Noma to her chest, as if the storm itself had taken form. Elias moved to the door and opened it a crack. A dark figure on horseback emerged from the curtain of rain, tall, lean, hunched in a slick duster coat. He didn't bother to dismount, just called out, looking for a runaway squaw with a whelp. "Where does she pass this way?" Elias didn't answer. The man spat into the mud. "Name's Jonah Cray. She was mine." Mariah stood frozen behind the curtain near the hearth. The baby whimpered once, then stilled, as if even she could taste the air turning sour. Elias stepped onto the porch, letting the storm batter his shoulders. He didn't reach for the rifle yet, just stared. "No one here by that name?" he said. Grace squinted through the rain. "I seen tracks lead here. Got a bounty paper if it matters. She's property. That thing she's holding? That's mine too." The storm roared above them, lightning splitting again over the ridge. Elias didn't flinch. "You should ride on, Mr. Cray." Cray snorted. "You harboring her? There's no one here by that name." They locked eyes for a moment. Cray's horse pawed the ground, anxious beneath the thunder. "I'll be back," Cray growled. "With a name, a paper, and a rope." Then he turned and vanished into the rain. Elias stood still until the sound of hooves faded into the hills. Then he closed the door and bolted it, water pooling beneath his boots. Mariah hadn't moved. Held the baby too tight, her face wet with tears that hadn't made a sound. "I brought him here," she whispered. "I curse this place." Elias walked to the hearth, unhooked the old rifle from above the door, set it down beside him for the first time in over a decade. He sat. "You stay as long as you want," he said. Her breath caught in her throat. She lowered herself to the rug, not far from him, and pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The baby stirred in her arms, then quieted. Thunder rolled again, softer now. The wind was passing. Noma, restless since birth, blinked up at Elias, and for the first time reached toward him. He didn't move at first, just stared at the tiny fingers stretching like they were trying to touch something safe. Mariah looked. At him, you don't have to. But Elias had already leaned forward, gently, without saying a word. He scooped the baby into his arms and rested her against his chest. She fit there like something long missing. The cradle sat beside them, but neither used it that night. The rifle leaned nearby, untouched. Mariah stretched the shawl to dry near the fire. Steam rose from the wool-like breath returning to a cold room. Elias rocked slowly, and Noma slept. The days softened, as they tend to do when no one names the herd out loud. Morning came with the cry of the rooster and the warm smell of ash and coffee. Elias rose early, as always, and Mariah was already stoking the fire before the sun pulled itself fully above the mesa rim. She'd taken to milking the goat each dawn. She sang while she did it, not words Elias understood, but sounds that soothed the animal and floated on the cool air like incense. Elias never asked what the song meant. Figured if she wanted him to know, she'd say, "He patched fences during the day tending to his land with the quiet patience of someone who knew it didn't really belong to him." She washed linens by the river, hung them to dry on a line between two brittle junipers. They shared little beyond the work. Still, something threaded between them, not quite closeness, but not distance either. The baby Noma became their bridge. She giggled whenever Elias whistled low through his teeth. She reached for him now, not just Mariah. Her fingers curled around his thumb like they belonged there, and Elias let her. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of things neither had the language to speak. One afternoon, young stallion bucked Elias hard and sent him into the dust with a crack that echoed across the pasture. He limped back late, blood on his sleeve, teeth clenched against pain. Mariah met him at the door, lips parted but no words coming. Just the shoulder, he said. Pride's worse. He sat in the chair while she fetched a basin and cloth. She didn't ask, just peeled back his shirt and dabbed at the blood. When her fingers grazed the raised line of an old scar across his shoulder blade, he flinched, not from pain. From something older. She paused. He said nothing. The silence cracked, just slightly. She rose and left the room. That night, she didn't sing. The next evening, Elias stood on the porch, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. Mariah sat on the split-rail fence, brushing her hair. In long strokes, beneath a peach-colored sky, the strands gleamed like dark water. Rippling with memory, Elias watched, unashamed, cup in hand. Your people, he said. They braid truth into hair. Is that right? She turned slowly. That's what my mother used to say, he tilted his head. What does yours say? There she looked at him, not through him at him. That I survived, she said. He didn't answer, but his grip on the cup shifted, knuckles whitening. Inside the house, the baby cooed from the cradle. Elias had started carving it years ago, before Anna's pregnancy. It had sat unfinished in the corner all this time until he'd shaped the final slat 2 weeks ago and laid it by the fire. Now it rocked gently, on it carrying the weight of a child, who hadn't been expected but hadn't been refused. Later that night, Elias took an old tobacco tin from a drawer. Inside, it lay a tarnished gold ring Anna's, and a faded ribbon from their wedding day. He didn't open it fully, just held it a moment, then set it back where it belonged. Mariah didn't see that, but she heard the drawer close. She was sewing near the fire, baby sleeping beside her, and when she looked up, Elias was already sitting again in the rocking chair. The room was warm, the walls full of quiet. Mariah said, "You were kind to me when you didn't have to be." Elias nodded. Didn't feel like kindness. What did it feel like? He looked at her a long time, then said something I could not do. She folded the cloth in her lap. Most men wouldn't have stopped. I ain't most men. The fire crackled, cradle creaked, and still they did not touch. But something had shifted. Not enough to name, but enough to feel. The next time Cray came, he didn't come alone. It was a colder morning than most, the kind that warned of early frost, with fog still clinging low over the creek beds. Elias was mending a fence post when the dust trail rose on the horizon. 2 riders. One in a stiff black coat, the other slouched in familiar Cray. And beside him, a man with a badge pinned to his vest, Deputy Hollis from the settlement near Dry Bluff. 20 miles south, Elias didn't move. He leaned on his fence post, arms steady, watching as the horses approached. Cray grinned with teeth, yellowed by. "Tobacco told you I'd be back," he said. Hollis dismounted, slow, careful. "We were told you're harboring a runaway. One with ties to an Apache camp and a history of theft. There's a claim made." Elias tilted his head. "No claim on my wife." The silence that followed was harder than the wind. Even Cray blinked, stunned. "Wife?" Hollis asked. Elias nodded once, slow. "Name's Mariah Cole now. She came. Here fair, stayed by choice. Baby's got my name on the ledger. That's all law needs, far as I know." Cray spat in the dirt. "You lying son of a—" "Watch your words," Elias said. Low and sure, Hollis glanced toward the cabin, where Mariah stood in the doorway, Mariah's shawl wrapped tight around her, the baby balanced on her hip. She didn't speak, didn't blink. Just stood still. Hollis sighed. "Ain't my business to untangle hearts. If she's your wife, she's not bounty." That's how the books read. Cray cursed, turned his horse, and galloped off without another word. Hollis lingered a breath longer, eyes meeting Elias's. "Don't make me ride out again," he said. Then he followed the dust trail out of their lives. Elias didn't go back inside right away. Stared at the earth for a while, boots rooted. The word he'd said, wife, felt like flint in his mouth. Hot, sharp, ancient. When he finally stepped inside, Mariah was no longer at the door. She sat at the table, quiet. The baby gurgled beside her, chewing the corner of a rag doll. He poured 2 cups of coffee. Set one in front of her, the other for himself. She didn't touch it. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. She looked up. "When the rains come, the river will rise." He waited. She continued, voice steady. They didn't say anything more for the rest of the afternoon. That night, the fire burned higher than usual. Not from cold. The room was warm enough, but from something else. Elias placed a fresh log on the flames, the sparks rising like startled birds. He sat on the far end of the bench by the hearth. Mara didn't take her usual chair. She came to him. She sat beside him, close, but not too close. Her shawl was gone. Her braid was loose down her back, unbound for the first time since she'd arrived. They didn't kiss, but her hand found his, and his hand didn't pull away. It was a quiet moment. No confession. No vows. No promises made. Just 2 people who had stayed when they didn't have to, chosen what they could have run from. The firelight reflected in her eyes. He watched it flicker there, dancing soft across her cheekbones, catching the tremble in her bottom lip. His thumb moved gently across her knuckles. Later that week, Leah spent the morning in the barn, carving something from a block of cedar he'd once meant for a saddle horn. When he gave it to her, he didn't speak. Just opened his hand and placed it in. Hers it was a comb. Wide, curved, with edges smoothed by care. Mariah stared at it for a long time, then rose and walked to the mantel. Beside the old mirror, once his wife's, she placed the comb carefully, wood beside glass. Her now beside the memory of before that night she braided her hair with it for the first time, and Elias slept without waking once. The letter came with no signature, only a stamp and a folded note bearing Elias's name. It arrived by courier from Dry Bluff, delivered by a thin boy on a mule who wouldn't meet Elias's eye. The contents were simple, a summons to testify before a traveling circuit judge on the matter of harboring a fugitive and obstructing settler law. Elias read it twice. Then once more for good measure. He didn't curse, didn't slam the door, just folded it, tucked it into the pocket of his coat, and stared at the fire for a long while. When he finally told Mariah, said nothing for a moment. Then she spoke with her back to him, her voice soft as the baby's breath. "I'll go with you." Elias turned, surprised. "They want me, not you." She held Noma close, wrapped in her shawl. "Then I'll be seen with you." He didn't argue. He knew better now. The morning of the hearing came bitter and white. Early snow falling in hushes, dusting the road and whitening the earth like regret trying to make itself pure. Mariah sat beside him on the wagon seat, baby bundled tight against her chest. She didn't speak as they rode, and neither did he. But her hand never left the edge of his coat. That small contact, firm, quiet, said all that needed saying. The townsfolk stared as they entered. Some murmured, some looked away. The courthouse. It was a small wooden hall, half converted from an old grain barn, with creaking benches and a pot-bellied stove that did little to warm the room. The judge was a thin, weary man with graying hair and a wool coat that had seen better decades. He listened to the deputy first, then to Cray, who rattled on about stolen property and cross-blood troublemakers. Mariah sat still through it all, back straight, braid falling over her shoulder. The baby cooed softly against her chest. Then Elias was called. He stood tall, though his knees ached from the ride and the cold had found his spine. "I found her by the river," he said. "She was bleeding. Baby had just been born. No horse, no coat, no food. She was going to die, and so was the child." "And did you know she was being pursued?" the judge asked. Elias didn't blink. I knew she was afraid. I knew she'd been mistreated. And I knew what a man becomes when he looks at a woman and sees something to own. The room was quiet enough to hear the logs settle in the stove. She ain't property, Elias added. She's a mother, a human being, and she's my wife now. A few gasps murmured through the benches, but no one dared speak louder. The judge looked down at his notes, then looked over at the child who, right then, giggled, reaching up toward the dust motes swirling in the beam of light from a cracked window. He cleared his throat. There is no rightful claim of ownership on a person in this territory, the judge said at last. Not by birth, not by marriage, not by coin. And there's no law that punishes a man for choosing decency. He banged the gavel. Case dismissed. Outside the snow had thickened, blanketing the wagon and the trail. Home, Elias helped Mariah climb up, careful not to jostle the baby. They didn't smile. But something in their eyes softened, as if an invisible pack had been laid down. The journey home was longer, slower. But the silence was warm. When they arrived, Elias built a new fire. Mariah placed the baby in the cradle and hummed something. Soft and low, a melody with no words, only memory. Elias stood by the doorway for a long while, eyes on the beam overhead. He fetched his carving knife, the one he hadn't touched since before Anna passed, and climbed the small ladder by the hearth. He worked in steady strokes, not rushed, not afraid. By the time the fire had burned down 2 coals, a new name had. Join the old ones above the door. No Macoltha. Baby's breath rose and fell gently from the cradle. Mariah curled up beside it on the rug, her hair loosed, her braid redone, soft and chosen. Elias poured 2 mugs of coffee, one for himself, and one he handed to her. This time she took it, and this time he sat beside her, outside. The snow kept falling, but inside a new season had begun.